Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Coffee and Jesus Stuff. It is day 20 of the quarantine. It is April 1st, April Fool's Day, so happy April Fool's Day, everybody. I'm not sure that the world is in a joking mood today, but that is today. And I'm going to get right rolling into the book of Mark. Remember that Mark is one of the four Gospels. The Gospels are the biographies of Jesus. So in the Gospels, we see what it means for God to take on flesh, what it looks like for God to interact with people, and specifically, I want to focus on that today because this one is for, now remember we said that God interacting with people meant that the first thing he did was recategorize religious social order, who's in and who's out, the clean, the unclean. The second thing that he did was he attacked rituals, and he also blanketed forgiveness, which really upset the religious community. Now the next thing, he's gonna take on rules. So for those of you who were raised in a religious environment, maybe you went to a religious school, maybe you got cracked on the knuckles by rulers from some ninja nuns, and maybe you had oppressive parents, maybe you still do. If your view of God has been hurt by oppressive authority figures, here's what I want you to do. Please look to Jesus for your view of God. Look to Jesus for how you reinterpret, because Jesus came to sort all that out, to break down categories. And so let's look at what Jesus does for our view of God, not what that nun that cracked you on the knuckles for cracking a smile or a joke in class. Okay, so here we go. This is Luke chapter 2. Jesus is already like on a tear, ripping down religious stuff. And he's just getting going. We're just at the end of chapter 2. Okay, so here we go. This is verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees, now the Pharisees were the nuns of that day. They were like the religious authoritarian figures. The Pharisees were saying to him, look, what are they doing? They are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. And he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how they entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. They essentially broke into the Vatican and drank the baptistry water. And then they gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man. This is Jesus. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then he says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of or over the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Now here's what's going on here. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm going to try to do it quick. The Sabbath was the ultimate rule for Jewish society. They were to do no work from sundown to sundown at the end of the week. It was to honor one of the 10 commandments. Honor the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. They weren't allowed to do any work. And the Pharisees, the religious oppressive Gestapo police of the day, had kind of decided what that meant. And one of the things you were not allowed to do was work with crops. And so the disciples are walking with Jesus, and they're hungry, and they mix some, they do that to get some grain heads, and they eat. And the Pharisees they want to write a ticket. They're like, you can't do that on the Sabbath. Jesus, what do you do? Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath. Jesus then points to a moment in Jewish history when David, one of the great Jews of all time, did the same thing, only to a higher level. And he's like, you don't say anything about that. Then he says, the Sabbath, the rule, okay, the rule was made to help people. People were not created for rules. So let that be your view of God. Let that be your view of God that says God is reasonable. He gives us guidelines for our own good. But if somehow it gets flipped and we're oppressed by the things he's given us as guidelines, then that's out of order, and Jesus recategorizes that. He says that, so then this is huge in understanding it, and especially with your view of God. Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord even over the rule. Now, what does that mean? This is huge if you have an oppressive view of God. The Son of Man, we talked about this a couple episodes ago. In the book of Daniel, written hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus, the Son of Man, or the human one like a human, he came to bring God's kingdom to earth. He came on the clouds. That means he came to bring judgment, to sort it all out. The human one would sort it all out. So when Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath, what he's doing, he's saying, I am God in the flesh here to sort it all out. And what I say is that rules were made to help people, not people made to serve rules. So some of you got a miserable dose when you were growing up of oppressive rules. And now your thinking about God and church and faith is tainted by that oppressive, rule-oriented approach to God. Look to Jesus. Look to Jesus for your view of God. He came to sort all that out, to tear all that down, to take the power away from the religious authoritarian figure, to make God accessible. And he essentially says, yes, there are guidelines that God gives us for our own good, but use your brain. Don't be oppressed by those rules. Use them to understand proper ordering of how things should be in the case of the Sabbath. Yeah, take a day off every now and then. We're all learning about life with a day off every now and then, right now in our society. But that rule was meant to help us from becoming workaholic machines. It wasn't meant to oppress us, and that applies to all the things. Love God, love people, and then approach his guidelines looking for what's the spirit of this, and then do what makes sense. So I hope you will reorder your view of God around what you see from Jesus, which is why it's so important to read Scripture and look at Jesus as the representative of God, because he comes to bring freedom. And then recategorize your view of God from what you see in Jesus, and I promise you that will set you free. Enjoy your Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday. And I will see you back tomorrow at 9 a.m. for episode 6. Have a good one, everybody.